Hello and welcome with Gardner Intelligence. I'm Michael Gukas, Chief Economist and Director of Analytics. I'm pleased to present to you the business index data through the end of October. For the month, the Gardner Business Index registered 53.9. That is the fastest pace of business activity growth that we have seen going all the way back to the beginning of 2019. And if you go back to that time, you'll remember that we were coming off of one of the longest business cycle expansions that we've ever recorded in the history of the GBI. If you look at the six components that formulate the business index, this top one here you'll see in green is the supplier deliveries reading. And I want to talk about that component for just a few minutes here because it's so important to understand its impact on the business index and also the impact that it may very well have in the very near future here as we come to finish up 2020. If you look at that line, you'll see that it spiked right around April or so of this year, and the reason for that was because of the disruption to supply chains. When we calculate the business activity around supplier deliveries, what we're asking in the survey is what is happening to the order to fulfillment time period. If the order to fulfillment time period is lengthening for manufacturers in order for them to receive their intermediate goods from their upstream suppliers, then this number rises. And the reason why we calculated this way has to do with more normal business conditions and economic cycles. In a more normal time period, if all of the manufacturers were experiencing strong economic growth, they would all be making lots of orders for intermediate goods and putting a lot of demand on their upstream suppliers. Those upstream suppliers would then have to deal with the growing backlog of orders. And their growing backlogs would end up lengthening the order to fulfillment time period. And that is why in our index, when we calculate it, and the way that we ask the question in the survey, those lengthening order to fulfillment time periods cause the supplier deliveries rating to increase so that it increases the overall index rating as well, so that everything moves together as it should, again, during normal business cycle periods. What we've seen here, of course, in 2020 is a massive disruption to supply chains as governments all across the world attempt to combat the spread of COVID by implementing different rules and regulations. And so that is why when new orders and production and backlogs and export orders and employment, all of those things fell precipitously during the first and second quarters of the year, but of course supply chains went in exactly the opposite direction. And again, that has everything to do with the fact that this is just such a different type of economic situation from what we're used to dealing with when it comes to a business index like this, or any of them. The PMI works the same way, and it's struggling the same way as ours is. But as you come up to the more recent periods here, as we look at it, supplier deliveries started to slow, the number started to fall, and that was a good thing because it meant that to some degree suppliers were able to come up with a new way of operating under the shadow of COVID. But if you look at the latest data from September and now also October, you can see that we're starting to move back up on the supplier delivery readings. I do wonder if to some degree that's a function of just seasonal demand for freight and shipping services. Of course, we're coming into the holiday seasons. And also on top of that, thankfully, we're also seeing a lot of new growth in demand for whether it's manufactured goods, consumer goods, etc. And so all of these things are going to be putting extra demands on shippers at this point in time. And some of the delay that we're seeing in deliveries might be a function of that, and it might not be specific to manufacturing. But it is going to have an overall impact on the index. And that's why, if you've been watching our Gardner Business Index videos here in recent months, you'll see that we've done this, where we've taken the normal Gardner Business Index here in blue, registering 53.9 again for the end of October, and I've overlaid it with the business index with the exclusion of supplier deliveries. And so what I've done is, rather than averaging the six components, I'm averaging the five components less supplier deliveries here in orange, and you can see the influence that it has had on the index, especially this year. You can see, in fact, that at the worst of the COVID pandemic here back in April, the index would have been well below 30 without the supplier deliveries reading. But because of supplier deliveries working the way it does and it having such an inflated figure here in recent months, the bottom of the GBI back in the April through June period really never got far below 35. By size, it's been really interesting to see how supplier deliveries are impacting manufacturing. And so you can see here several different lines, and these are all categorizing different sizes of manufacturers by employee count. You can see here that the smallest shops between 1 and 19 employees continue to report the most challenging business conditions when you control for, or in other words, remove supplier deliveries from the equation here. And then you can see that medium-sized and larger firms have all begun to report improving conditions. So not only have conditions stabilized, but they're actually getting better again on a month-to-month basis. And then lastly, just to close out this month, I want to remind all of you about the importance of diversification. This is something that my team, Steve and I have gone around the country and even the world. We've had that privilege to talk about the importance of diversification. And you can see here in one chart why it is so important. And you can see here, for example, that petrochemicals, automotive, and custom processors, manufacturers serving those end markets are seeing the strongest turnaround right now. Obviously it's still very early in a turnaround, all things considered, but by comparison, industrial motors and aerospace manufacturing continue to struggle disproportionately more than many of the other end markets that we track. And this is why we are always encouraging manufacturers to think about your diversification strategy. Make sure that you have one. Make sure that you are implementing one where your end markets can help to offset each other, so that you're in a situation where if one of your end markets is weak, hopefully another one is strong, and you can use that to help level set your business. If you have more questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly, or you can visit our website at gardnerintelligence.com. And we thank you so much for your time. We thank you for your support, especially if you're one of those manufacturers who's filling out our Gardner Business Index surveys. We really appreciate that. We couldn't do this work without your help and your support. We look forward to serving you in the coming months. Thank you so much.